The gavel had not yet fallen, but Inez Lockhart could already feel the weight of everything she was about to lose pressing down on her chest like a stone pulled from the bottom of a river. She stood at the edge of the crowd gathered in the dusty square of Caldwell, Kansas, on a Thursday morning in October of 1882, and every single person present knew why she was there. They had come to watch. Some of them had come to profit. A handful of them, she suspected, had come simply to see a woman fail. The auctioneer, a sweating, red-faced man named Grover Pitts who smelled of pipe tobacco and cheap bay rum, cleared his throat and adjusted the papers on his makeshift podium. He did not look at Inez. He had not looked at her once since she arrived, which told her everything she needed to know about the nature of this particular betrayal. "Lockhart Parcel," Pitts announced to the crowd, his voice carrying the practiced indifference of a man who sold land the way a butcher sold cuts of meat. 412 acres, South Fork tributary, established grazing rights, existing structures including a main dwelling and 2 outbuildings. Deed of trust defaulted as of September 30th. Sale is legal and binding. We open at $1,200. Inez's hands were clasped in front of her so tightly that her knuckles had gone white beneath her worn cotton gloves. She was 28 years old. She had worked that land for 6 years alongside her father before his death, and she had absolutely no money with which to bid on her own home. What she had was a secret, and a fury so deep it had burned away every softer thing inside her until only the hard, clean bone of her will remained. 1,200, called a voice from the left side of the crowd. She knew that voice. Randolph Kane, owner of the Kane Livestock Company, a man with 3,000 acres already to his name, and a particular appetite for acquiring whatever bordered his holdings. He was the reason the deed of trust had defaulted. He was the reason the bank in Wichita had called the loan early, 2 months before the legal notice period should have permitted. She knew this because she had ridden to Wichita herself and stood in that bank office with a letter from her father's attorney, and the young clerk behind the counter had gone pale and nervous in a way that told her the whole thing had been arranged long before she ever walked through that door. Betrayal. The word had lived in her throat for 3 weeks like a splinter she could not work free. She had ridden back to Caldwell with nothing but that splinter and the absolute refusal to simply disappear, which was what Kane and his people expected a widow-adjacent woman alone on a quarter section to do when the walls closed in. So she stood, in front of everyone, and she waited. "$12.50, said another voice, and then the auction began in earnest, numbers rising and falling through the morning air, and Inez watched it all with the particular stillness of a woman who has already run out of ordinary options and is now waiting on something extraordinary. She had sent a letter. 3 weeks ago, the same day she returned from Wichita, she had written a letter to Benjamin Hudson of the Hudson Cattle Company, whose range ran along the northern boundary of Sumner County, and whose reputation was the kind that men told stories about in saloons not to embellish, but simply because the facts were already remarkable enough. She had heard of him. Everyone in the county had heard of him, but she had never met the man, and she had no particular reason to think he would respond to a letter from a woman he did not know, asking for help she had no right to request from a stranger. But she had written it anyway because sometimes desperation and dignity arrive at the same doorstep, and you just have to knock and see who answers. She had not received a reply. The bidding climbed toward $2,000. Randolph Kane stood near the front, thick arms crossed over his barrel chest, a flat-brimmed hat casting shadow over his eyes. He bid with the calm of a man who already considers something his. His foreman, a tall, thin man named Decker, stood beside him writing figures in a small ledger. Inez breathed in through her nose and kept her eyes on the auctioneer and told herself that whatever happened next, she would not cry. Not here, not in front of Kane. Not in front of any of them. 2,000, Pitts called out, and the crowd had thinned to spectators now, the smaller bidders having dropped away. Do I hear 2,100? Silence. And then from the back of the crowd came a voice she did not recognize. $5,000. The crowd split apart the way water splits around a stone. People moved, turned, craned their necks, and through the gap that opened in the assembled bodies, Inez saw a man she had never seen before walking forward with the unhurried, ground-eating stride of someone entirely accustomed to making everyone else wait for him. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, dressed in a dark brown coat over a pale shirt, and he wore a hat that had seen considerable use. He was not young, not old, somewhere in the middle years where a man either looks worn down or hammered into shape, and this one had clearly been hammered. His jaw was set, his eyes were moving across the crowd with a quality of calm appraisal that Inez recognized as the look of a man who has walked into difficult rooms before and knows exactly how to measure danger. Pitts was sputtering. "Sir, the standard increment, $5,000, the man said again without raising his voice. "Cash. I have a bank draft from the First National Bank of Wichita. Or we can do it in coin if that suits you better, but that will take considerably longer, and I imagine everyone has other places to be." Randolph Kane's face had gone a particular shade of red that Inez found deeply satisfying even in the middle of her shock. "Who in blazes are you?" Kane demanded. The man turned to look at him. There was something in that look that made Kane, despite himself, take half a step back. "Benjamin Hudson," the man said. The name moved through the crowd like a current. Inez stood very still and felt something she had not felt in 3 weeks, which was the specific sensation of not being entirely alone. Benjamin Hudson had come. He had not replied to her letter. He had simply arrived. The gavel fell. $5,000 and the Lockhart land was sold to Benjamin Hudson. Inez did not understand yet what that meant. She stood in the Caldwell Square with the crowd beginning to disperse around her, and she watched Benjamin Hudson receive the papers from Grover Pitts and sign them with a pen borrowed from Pitts' coat pocket, and she tried to work out whether she had just been saved or simply acquired by a different kind of man. She was still working on that question when he turned from the table and walked directly toward her. He stopped about 4 feet away. Close enough to talk, far enough to be decent about it. He looked at her with gray eyes that had the quality of autumn sky, not cold exactly, but clear enough to see through. "Miss Lockhart," he said. "Mrs.," she corrected, though the word had lost most of its meaning 2 years ago when Thomas Lockhart had died of a fever that took him in 4 days and left her alone with a mortgage and 400 acres and the particular kind of grief that comes from losing not just a man but the entire plan you had built your life around. "Widow," he nodded, absorbing this without apparent discomfort. "Mrs. Lockhart, I'm Benjamin Hudson. I got your letter. You didn't reply. I know. I apologize for that. I wanted to see the situation myself before I made any promises." She looked at him steadily. There were things she needed to know, and she was not inclined to ask them gently. "You just paid $5,000 for my land, Mr. Hudson. I'd like to understand what you expect in return for that." Something moved through his expression, brief and complicated. "Nothing that you're thinking," he said. "If you can walk with me for a few minutes, I'll explain." She studied him for another moment. Behind him, she could see Randolph Kane speaking in low, angry tones to his foreman Decker, and both of them were looking in her direction with expressions that told her this was not over, not by a considerable distance. "All right," she said. "A few minutes." They walked to the edge of the square and then along the side street that ran past the feed store, away from the remaining crowd. The morning was cool and the wind was coming from the north carrying the smell of grass and distant rain. Inez kept a careful distance between herself and this man she did not know, and she catalogued what she could observe about him, which was a habit she had developed since Thomas's death because you could not afford to trust blindly when you were managing everything alone. Benjamin Hudson walked like a man comfortable with open space. His hands, when he was not gesturing, fell naturally to his sides rather than hooked in his belt or crossed over his chest, which she interpreted as a sign of someone with nothing to prove at the moment. His coat was good quality but not new. His boots were working boots. He was, she estimated, somewhere in his mid-30s, perhaps 35 or 36, which meant he was old enough to have made himself and young enough that whatever he had built was still growing. "I've been watching the Kane situation for about 8 months," he said, once they were out of earshot of the main street. "Randolph Kane has been running a particular kind of operation in this county for the last 4 years. He identifies properties he wants, usually smaller operations that are vulnerable, and then he uses his relationship with certain people at the Wichita Federal Bank to pressure loans and call debts early. It's not entirely legal, but it's been difficult to prove." Inez stopped walking. "You know about the bank." "I know about the bank." He stopped too and turned to face her. "Your letter confirmed several things I'd already suspected. You're not the first person this has happened to. You're the third in Sumner County, and the fifth if you count the 2 cases in the neighboring county that I'm fairly certain are connected." The force of this took a moment to settle. She had known something was wrong, had felt the outline of the trap she had walked into. But to hear it described in these specific terms, to know that her particular suffering was part of a pattern that someone had been tracking, was something different altogether. It made her feel at once less alone and more furious. "Why did you come?" she asked. "You don't know me, this isn't your land." He was quiet for a moment in a way that felt honest rather than evasive. "It borders my range," he said finally. "Practically speaking, that gives me an interest, but that's not the whole of it." He looked out across the dry October grass toward the edge of town. "My mother homesteaded alone for 3 years in Missouri after my father died. I was 7. I watched people try to take what she'd built." He paused. "She kept it, but not without help." Inez felt something shift slightly in the architecture of her wariness, just slightly. "What happens now?" she asked. "You own my land." "I bought it to prevent Kane from taking it," he said, and reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a folded document. "This is a deed transfer. I had it drawn up before I came. It transfers the land back to you, free and clear, no mortgage, no lien attached. The $5,000 paid off your debt and covered the transfer fees. What's left is yours." She stared at the folded paper. She did not reach for it immediately. "Why would you do that?" she asked, and her voice came out quieter than she intended. "Because it's right," he said simply. She took the deed from him. She unfolded it and read it carefully, word by word, because she was not going to let sentiment make her careless. The language was clean and correct. The transfer was to Inez Lockhart, sole and unconditional. No conditions, no reversions, no obligations. She folded it again and held it against her chest and breathed. "Thank you," she said, and it came out rough, because the thing she had been holding for 3 weeks needed somewhere to go, and it chose this moment to loosen just slightly. "You're welcome," Benjamin Hudson said, and had the good sense not to say anything else. They stood together in that side street in Caldwell for a moment, with the deed in her hands and the wind coming down from the north, and neither of them knew yet that this was not an ending but a beginning, and that the beginning had roots already growing through the hard soil between them, whether either of them had planned for it or not. What happened in the next several days was not what Inez expected. She had expected Benjamin Hudson to return to his own range, having done his good deed, and for her to return to hers, having received it. That was the logical shape of the transaction, and she had organized her feelings accordingly, filing the gratitude in one place and the wariness in another, and telling herself that a man who helped once was not necessarily a man who would stay. What actually happened was that Randolph Kane sent 3 of his hired men to her property 2 days after the auction. She was in the barn when they arrived, mending a harness that had cracked along the brow band, and she heard horses in the yard, and came out to find them sitting on their animals looking at her buildings with the particular proprietary assessment of men who have been told something is already theirs. The one in front, a thick-set man with a beard going gray at the edges, leaned over his saddle horn and said, "Mr. Kane wants to know if you've thought any more about his offer." "Mr. Kane has made no offer," Inez said, standing in the barn doorway with the repaired harness over her shoulder. Mr. Kane made an attempt to steal my land through a fraudulent bank process. Those are different things. The man's expression shifted in a way she did not like. Mr. Kane says the situation isn't resolved. Says the Hudson purchase may not hold up under certain scrutiny. The deed transfer is registered at the county courthouse, she said. I walked it in myself yesterday morning. It is entirely legal. If Mr. Kane would like to dispute it, he is welcome to do so in front of Judge Alcott, whose court sits in Wichita every third Monday. They looked at her. She looked back at them. The wind moved through the yard and one of the horses stamped, and the moment extended itself in that particular way that moments do when nobody is quite sure what happens next. Then hoofbeats came from the north. Benjamin Hudson rode into her yard with 2 of his own men behind him, and she realized only later that he had placed someone to watch the property, which she did not know whether to be grateful for or insulted by. But in the moment, she was simply glad for the presence of additional bodies. He did not look at Kane's men with anger or aggression. He looked at them with the same quality of calm appraisal she had noted at the auction, and it was perhaps more unsettling for its lack of heat. "Afternoon," he said. "I'm going to ask you to turn those horses around and ride back to wherever you came from, and I'm going to ask you only once, because I'm a man who means what he says and doesn't feel the need to repeat himself." Kane's men looked at each other. "Tell Mr. Kane," Benjamin continued, "that the land is deeded, the sale is registered, and any further harassment of Mrs. Lockhart will be documented and presented to the county sheriff, and if necessary, to the federal marshal's office in Topeka. We've had some correspondence with them already regarding the bank irregularities. I'd recommend he think carefully about how much scrutiny his business arrangements can comfortably withstand." The thick-set man said nothing for a long moment, then gathered his reins and turned his horse. The other 2 followed. They rode back down the track toward the main road without looking behind them. Inez waited until they were gone before she turned to Benjamin Hudson. "You have men watching my property," she said. "I have men in the area," he said carefully. "They're moving cattle. I asked them to keep an eye on things as they passed." "That is a very careful answer," she said. "I'm a careful man." She looked at him. The afternoon light was falling at a low angle across the yard, and in it she could see the details of his face more clearly than she had before, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into open sky, the slight scar along his jawline that was old enough to have faded to near invisible, the way he sat a horse as though the horse were simply an extension of the ground beneath him. "Come inside," she said. "I have coffee." It was not an invitation she had intended to extend. It came out before she had fully made the decision, which was unusual for her. She was generally a person who made her decisions first and acted on them second. Benjamin dismounted and told his men he would meet them at the north pasture in an hour, and he followed her into the house with his hat in his hand, which was a courtesy she noted and filed away. The house was small but orderly. She kept it clean because order was a form of control, and she found that she needed all the forms of it she could maintain. There was a round table near the window where the light came in best, and she put the coffee on the stove, and they sat across from each other in the way that 2 people sit when they are not quite sure of the nature of their relationship yet, but have decided to explore it cautiously. "Tell me about your operation," she said, because she needed to understand who this man was, and asking him about his work was the most direct way she knew to learn a person. He told her. The Hudson Cattle Company ran approximately 1,800 head across 1,200 acres of Sumner County range, leasing additional grazing rights from 2 smaller landowners on the county's northern edge. He had built it from 400 acres and 200 head that he had purchased at 22 with money. He had saved working trail drives from Texas to the Kansas railheads over 3 years. Before that, he had grown up on a Missouri farm that his mother had kept against considerable difficulty after his father's death. And before the trail driving, he had worked a season as a hand on a ranch in the Colorado Territory, and another season on a sheep operation in New Mexico. which he mentioned with the self-deprecating humor of a man who knows that admitting to sheep is unusual in cattle country. She found herself listening with genuine attention, which surprised her. She was not a woman who had found it easy to be interested in people since Thomas died. Grief had put a kind of glass between her and the world, and she had grown accustomed to seeing things clearly but not quite feeling them. She told him a little of her own story, carefully, in the way you test ice before you put your full weight on it. Her father had come to Kansas in 1871, homesteading on the strength of the Homestead Act, and had built the original cabin and put in the first water. She had come to live with him at 22, when her marriage to Thomas Lockhart brought her west from Ohio. Thomas had been a decent man and a willing farmer, but not a lucky one, and when he died in the spring of 1880, he left her the land and the debt and a grief that had taken considerably longer than she expected to begin to soften. "You've managed it alone for 2 years," Benjamin said. It was not phrased as a question exactly. "I have," she said. "That's considerable." She looked at him carefully, checking for condescension. She found none. It appeared to be simply an observation, offered in the way that a person who has done difficult things himself recognizes them in others. "It has been," she agreed. He stayed for 2 hours, and the coffee grew cold and she made more, and they talked about the land and the water rights on the South Fork, and the way the winter could come in fast off the flats when the conditions were right. They talked about Kane and his particular method of operation, and what evidence might be needed to bring the bank irregularities to proper legal attention. They talked about cattle prices and the way the railroad's expansion was changing the economics of the whole region and what it might mean for smaller operations in the next 5 years. He left when the light began to go gold and the first edge of evening cold came down from the north, and he shook her hand at the door the way a person shakes the hand of someone they take seriously, not a social gesture but a real one, and said he would check in within the week. She watched him ride north and then went back inside and stood at her kitchen table for a long time looking at nothing in particular, aware of a warmth in her chest that she found both welcome and slightly alarming. He came back in 4 days. He came back on a Saturday, which was not a coincidence. She understood this because he arrived at mid-morning, which was an hour that had no practical cattle-driving justification and was clearly a social call, and he brought with him a copy of the Wichita Eagle newspaper because he had apparently learned in their conversation that she read it when she could get a copy, and she had not been to town in 2 weeks. She found this particular gesture disproportionately moving, which she recognized as a symptom of having been managed alone for so long that small attentions had accumulated into something meaningful. They sat at the round table again and read sections of the newspaper aloud to each other, commenting and arguing, and she discovered that he had opinions on the new Kansas governor that were somewhat different from her own, and they debated this with considerable energy, and she realized partway through the debate that she was enjoying herself, genuinely, in a way she had not expected to be capable of any more. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. The visits settled into a rhythm that neither of them named or formally established, but which had its own momentum and warmth and particular quality of anticipation. She began to look forward to Saturdays with a ferocity that embarrassed her slightly, and that she spent the rest of the week trying to talk herself out of and entirely failing. In the 5th week, he brought her a copy of a letter he had sent to the federal marshal's office in Topeka, documenting the pattern of bank irregularities connected to the Kane operation. He had included her situation along with the other cases he had documented, framing it as part of a broader pattern of fraudulent debt manipulation in Sumner County. She read the letter carefully and then looked up at him. "You've been building this case for 8 months," she said. "More like a year," he said. "You were going to take it to the federal marshal regardless of whether my letter arrived." "Yes," he said. "My letter accelerated your timeline." "It did," she thought about this. "You didn't do this just for me," she said. I didn't do it only for you, he corrected, with a precision that she recognized as important. But you are part of the reason it happened when it did. You wrote that letter. That took courage, writing to a stranger asking for help you had no guarantee of receiving. I didn't have any other options left, she said honestly. Then it took a different kind of courage, he said. The kind that keeps going when it has run out of other things to run on. She looked at him for a moment. The afternoon light was doing something particular with the planes of his face, and she was aware of a feeling that she had not been entirely prepared for, something complicated and warm and slightly terrifying. Benjamin, she said, which was the first time she had used his given name, and she noted the slight change in his expression when she did. What are you doing on Saturdays? He met her eyes. Visiting you, he said. I know that. I mean, why? Is it about the land? The case against Cain. What is it? He was quiet for a moment in the particular way that indicated he was choosing his words carefully rather than evasively. I think you know it's not about the land, he said. And I think you know it's not about Cain. She did know. She had known for at least 2 Saturdays. What she had been doing was testing the knowledge, turning it over, checking it from different angles, which was her way of making sure she was not allowing loneliness or gratitude to masquerade as something more substantial. It was not loneliness and it was not gratitude. It was something more specific and more inconvenient and considerably more interesting. I've been alone for 2 years, she said. I'm not sure I know how to be not alone anymore. I've been alone considerably longer than that, he said, so we're in similar territory. She looked at him steadily. You're a careful man, she said, echoing her earlier observation. I am, he agreed. I'm a careful woman. I know. That could make things slow. I'm not in a hurry, he said, and then after a pause, I'm in somewhat of a hurry, but I can manage it. She laughed. It came out startling, genuine, the kind of laugh that arrives when you were not prepared for something to be that honest and that funny simultaneously. And she watched something happen in his face that she thought might be the moment he decided something, or possibly the moment he admitted to himself, something he had already decided. In the weeks that followed, the careful architecture of their getting to know each other began to develop small, significant cracks through which warmer things came through. He brought her father's kind of tobacco when he visited, because she had mentioned once that the smell of it sometimes comforted her. She kept the Eagle newspapers he brought in a stack by the window, and he noticed this without saying anything about it. She began to ride north on Tuesday mornings with a frequency that she told herself was related to checking the boundary fence, and that had nothing to do with the fact that the boundary between her property and his northern grazing lease was where she was most likely to encounter him. They did encounter each other several times, which she was certain was not coincidental on either side. In November, the first real cold came down and the grass went brown and hard, and he arrived one Saturday morning with 2 of his men carrying a load of seasoned wood that he stacked against the south side of her house without being asked, because he had assessed her woodpile in October and made a calculation about what she would need for winter, which was a practical and deeply thoughtful thing to do, and made her feel cared for in a way she had not felt cared for since before Thomas was sick. She stood in the cold watching him work and thought about hidden motives and dark pasts, and all the ways a person could appear one way and be another, and she examined what she knew of Benjamin Hudson against all of those concerns, carefully and honestly. What she found was this: he was consistent. Week after week he was the same man. He did not perform generosity for her benefit and then reveal something different in unguarded moments. He was direct about his opinions, and he changed them when presented with good evidence and not before. He did not talk about himself too much or too little. He asked her questions and listened to the answers with the full quality of his attention, not the performance of listening but the actual thing. He spoke of his mother with the particular combination of love and respect that she had found, in her experience, to be a reliable indicator of how a man relates to women as full human beings. She was falling in love with him. She had been falling in love with him since approximately the second Saturday, and she had been managing it carefully ever since, examining it like something fragile that might or might not be able to bear real weight. She thought it could bear weight. She was beginning to be fairly sure it could. In the second week of November, the news came from Wichita that the federal marshal's office had opened a formal investigation into the practices of the First National Bank of Wichita as they related to land acquisitions in Sumner County. The name Randolph Kane appeared prominently in the preliminary documents, which were public record, and which Inez read 3 times in the Eagle's coverage before allowing herself to feel the full measure of satisfaction that she had been keeping in reserve. Benjamin brought her the paper in person on a Wednesday, which was not a Saturday, which meant he had ridden a considerable distance from his range specifically because he wanted to be the one to tell her. She was hanging laundry when he rode into the yard. She saw him coming and let the sheet she was holding fall back into the basket and walked to meet him, and she could see from his expression before he even dismounted that it was good news. He handed her the paper without a word, and she read it standing in the cold November air with the wind moving her hair free of its pins. And when she finished, she looked up at him, and the relief of it, the genuine deep physical relief of knowing that the hidden trap had been exposed, and that she was not imagining the betrayal, and that justice had a shape and a name, and was moving toward the man who deserved it. That relief came out of her eyes before she could stop it. She did not cry often. She had made a rule of it, because crying in front of people had always felt like a surrender of something she needed to keep. But 2 tears escaped in the cold November wind, and she turned her face slightly so that he would not see them, which was a futile gesture because he was already stepping forward. He did not say anything. He simply put his hand over hers where she was holding the newspaper, and that was enough, more than enough, the warmth of a hand that belonged to a person who was fully on her side, and she turned back to face him and let herself be seen. "It's over," she said. "The investigation is just beginning," he said carefully, "but yes, for you it is largely over. Because of you. Because of the letter you had the courage to write," he said, "and because of the 3 other families you will never meet who shared their stories when we asked them to." She looked at him. His hand was still over hers. The wind was cold, and the laundry needed hanging, and the yard was ordinary and unremarkable, and none of that had any bearing on the particular quality of this moment. "Benjamin," she said. "Yes. I'm going to ask you something direct, and I would like a direct answer. That's the only kind I know how to give. Are you in love with me?" He looked at her for a moment with those gray October eyes. "Yes," he said, simply, cleanly, without qualification or performance. "I have been for some time." "I'm in love with you too," she said, and felt the words settle into the air between them like something that had found its right place after a long journey. He raised the hand he was holding and pressed his lips to her knuckles, not dramatically, not with any theatrical intention, just with a gentleness that cost him nothing because it was entirely natural to him, and she felt it move from the skin of her hand through the whole complicated geography of her interior. "I would like to call on you properly," he said, "if that's acceptable." "You've been calling on me every Saturday for 7 weeks, she pointed out. "I'd like to do it with stated intention," he said. "I want you to know what I'm hoping for, what I'd like it to become." She looked at him. "I know what you're hoping for," she said. "I've known for several weeks. I've been working up to being ready." "Are you ready?" "I think so. I might not be completely ready, but I think I'm ready enough to start." He smiled, and it was the first full smile she had seen from him, not the slight curve she had observed before, but a real one, and it changed his whole face into something that she felt land in her chest with a warmth that settled and stayed. "Then let's start," he said. The winter of 1882 went deep and cold in ways that kept people close to their homes and their fires, and it did not prevent Benjamin Hudson from calling on Inez Lockhart every Saturday and, increasingly, several days in between. The frozen ground and the short gray days became the backdrop for a courtship that was careful and real, and full of the particular quality of 2 people who had both been alone long enough to know what they were doing when they chose not to be. He met her neighbor, a woman named Clara Finch who homesteaded the adjacent property to the east with her husband Art, and they liked each other immediately in the comfortable way that good people like other good people. And Clara thereafter regarded Benjamin's visits with a warm approval that she expressed by occasionally appearing at Inez's door with cornbread or pie on the days she had seen his horse in the yard, which Inez found both sweet and extremely transparent. In December, he brought her to the Hudson Range to see it properly. She rode north with him on a clear cold morning when the sky was the blue of old glass and the frost was still thick on the grass, and she saw the work he had built, the clean lines of the main house, a proper frame house he had expanded twice as the operation grew, the tidy barn and the well-kept outbuildings, the cattle moving in the distance through the cold air like slow dark ships, and she felt the pride he had in it without his needing to say it, because it was in the way he moved through the place, easy and certain. His housekeeper, a Mexican woman named Señora Vargas who had been with him for 4 years, welcomed Inez with a warmth that was entirely genuine, and served them both coffee and a plate of sweet bread, and then managed to find things to do in other parts of the house with the tactful efficiency of a woman who understands the nature of growing things and knows not to crowd them. They sat in his parlor and the fire burned and outside the frost held, and they talked for 2 hours about nothing particular and everything important. And she felt at home in his house with a naturalness that she recognized as significant because she had not felt at home anywhere that was not her own land since Thomas died. He walked her out to her horse when it was time to go, and they stood in the cold yard with the horses stamping and their breath making pale clouds in the air, and he kissed her for the first time, not with hesitation but not with presumption either, with the careful certainty of a man who has thought about it long enough to be sure. And she kissed him back with the full presence of someone who has decided to stop managing her feelings at arm's length and let them simply be what they are. The cold wrapped around them, and the ranch was quiet, and it was, by any reasonable measure, the best kiss of her adult life, which she told herself was partly about timing and context, and partly about 2 years of solitude, and partly about the specific quality of this man's warmth and honesty, and the particular way he kissed as though she mattered, which she found she cared about considerably more than she had expected to care about anything again. She rode home in the late afternoon cold with her face warm and her thoughts in a pleasant disorder, and Clara Finch, who happened to be walking her fence line when Inez came back, took one look at her and said, "Well, it's about time," with the satisfaction of someone whose judgment has been confirmed. The investigation into Randolph Kane and the bank continued through the winter, and in February, a Wichita judge issued an order freezing certain assets and compelling the production of bank records related to the early loan calls in Sumner County. The Eagle ran 3 successive front-page articles on the matter, and Inez read them all at the round table with Benjamin across from her and a proper fire burning in the hearth. And the world outside was cold and just and moving in the direction it should. Kane himself, it emerged, had made a particular kind of error that men of his type often made, which was keeping meticulous records of his own corrupt dealings under the mistaken belief that those records would remain private. The bank clerk who had gone pale when Inez walked into his office in Wichita turned out to have kept copies of certain correspondence that he handed over to the marshal's investigators with the alacrity of a man who has been wanting to do exactly this for quite some time and was simply waiting for permission. By March, formal charges had been filed against Kane and 2 bank officers. The 2 other Sumner County families who had lost land through the same process were able to initiate civil recovery proceedings. The entire structure of the hidden operation, the betrayal of legitimate banking practice, the trap of artificially forced defaults, the dark machinery behind what had appeared to be simple foreclosure, came into the light and stayed there. Inez did not feel triumph exactly when she heard the final details. She felt something quieter and more complete, the specific satisfaction of having been right about the shape of an injustice and having lived long enough to watch it be named properly. She told Benjamin this, sitting in her kitchen on a March evening with the first real warmth of the coming spring in the air through the open window, and he listened to her describe it, and when she finished he said, "You deserve to feel every bit of that," and she knew he meant it exactly as he said it. In April he asked her to marry him. He did not make a performance of it. This was consistent with his character, which she had come to know with the confidence of someone who has paid close and willing attention. He asked her on a Tuesday morning when she was in her garden preparing the first beds for planting, which meant she was wearing her oldest dress and had dirt on her hands, and her hair was pinned up in the practical, efficient way she wore it for outdoor work, and none of those things appeared to matter to him in the slightest. He simply said, standing in the garden with the April light around them and the smell of turned earth in the air, "I would like you to be my wife, Inez. I want to build something permanent with you. I want to spend the rest of my life hearing you argue politics and reading newspapers with you and watching you run this land the way you run it, which is to say exceptionally well. I want to be the person who is here with you always, if that's something you want too." She had known this was coming. She had known it for months and had been quietly ready for it for nearly as long. But hearing it stated in his specific, direct, honest language, with the particular quality of his voice and the April garden around them, she felt it move through her with a warmth and completeness that she had not quite anticipated even in her readiness. "Yes," she said, "that is what I want." He smiled the real smile she had first seen in November, and she put her dirt-covered hand in his and held it there, and that was that. They married in June of 1883 at the Caldwell Methodist Church, a small building on the main street that could hold perhaps 60 people, and it held rather more than that on the day of their wedding, because the story of the auction and the deed transfer and the Kane investigation had made a particular impression on the county, and people wanted to see the end of it, which was also the beginning of something else. Clara and Art Finch sat in the second row. Senora Vargas came from the ranch and sat in the third row, and wept with a happiness that she made no effort to conceal. The federal marshal who had handled the Kane investigation sent a letter that Benjamin read to Inez the morning of the wedding, which expressed his felicitations and made mention of the case having been resolved the previous week when Randolph Kane and the two bank officers entered guilty pleas in the Wichita federal court, which was perhaps the finest wedding present either of them received. Inez wore a dress that Clara helped her make, deep blue wool that she had ordered from a catalog in Wichita, and which Clara's nimble hands had fashioned into something that was beautiful in a practical, real way. Not a costume, but a garment that belonged to who she actually was, which she thought was the right kind of wedding dress. Benjamin wore a dark coat she had not seen before, and his best hat, and the look on his face when she came down the aisle was something she intended to carry for the rest of her life. A look of such uncomplicated, clear, full happiness that it made everything she had endured to get to this room, and this moment feel entirely worth its weight. The ceremony was brief and honest. The minister, a sensible man who knew his congregation, did not add sentiment where it was not needed, and the vows they spoke were the traditional ones that had been spoken in that church 100 times before, and that sounded entirely new when you were the person speaking them and meaning every word. He kissed her in front of 60 people and several more standing in the doorway, and the church full of the county's people who had watched Inez Lockhart stand alone at that auction, and seen what came after made a sound of collective warm approval that she felt as a kind of gift. They celebrated at the church hall afterward with food that half the congregation had contributed to and music provided by 2 fiddle players, and a man with an accordion whose enthusiasm outpaced his precision, but who played with a joy that carried the whole room. Benjamin danced with her badly and willingly, which she found endearing, and she danced with Art Finch, who was excellent, and Benjamin watched this with an expression of amused appreciation rather than any dark thing, and she loved him for that too. Late in the evening, when the party had wound down to the last stubborn celebrants and the candles were burning low in the hall, they slipped out into the warm June night and walked down the quiet street toward where their horses were tied. And Inez felt the simple, extraordinary weight of being happy with another person, not despite the dark past, or the hidden traps and the forced choices and the betrayal of the last years, but somehow incorporating all of it, because all of it had led here to this man. To this night, to this particular quality of not being alone that was different from anything she had experienced before. She told him this. Standing in the warm June dark with their horses patient beside them, and the distant sound of the last fiddle note from the hall, she told him that she had not expected to be happy again, not this way, and that she was grateful for every improbable thing that had happened in the sequence of events that had brought them to each other. He listened with his full attention, as he always did, and then he said, "I'm grateful for you, the courage and the stubbornness and the bright particular way you see the world. I'm grateful for all of it." They rode home together under the June stars to the Lockhart land, which was hers free and clear, and had been since the morning Benjamin Hudson had stood in the Caldwell square and said $5,000 in a quiet, certain voice, and which was now also his in the way that all things belong to people who love each other honestly. The first year of their marriage was full of work and adjustment, and the particular pleasures of building a shared life from its foundations, which was different from maintaining an existing life alone, and required different muscles and different kinds of patience and different kinds of joy. They decided together to keep the Lockhart land as a separate working property, distinct from the Hudson Range to the north, because Inez wanted the independence of managing her own acreage, and Benjamin understood this with a clarity that came from having known her long enough to recognize what independence meant to her, which was not distance from him but integrity of herself, and he supported it without reservation. He hired 2 additional hands for her property's cattle operation, which she had expanded cautiously in the spring with a small herd of her own, and he worked with her in the evenings on the accounts and the breeding records with the cooperative attention of a man who considered her judgment equal to his own, which it was. They disagreed sometimes, about land management and about cattle prices, and about the best way to handle a particular dispute with a water rights holder upstream, and they argued these disagreements with energy and honesty, and without either of them needing to win in a way that diminished the other, which she had come to understand was one of the markers of the kind of love that lasts. In the second year of their marriage, Inez discovered she was expecting a child, which she had not known how to want after Thomas's death had made so many future things feel contingent and fragile. She told Benjamin on a November evening in the kitchen of what was now their shared home. The Lockhart house extended and improved over the summer with a new room added to the east side, and a proper indoor water pump that Benjamin had installed himself with the assistance of a plumber from Wichita, and she watched his face go through something she had never seen on it before. He sat down. He was a man who never sat down abruptly, who moved with that ground-eating certainty at all times, and he sat down as though his legs had made a decision without consulting him, and he looked at her with an expression so open and unguarded that she felt the intimacy of it all the way through. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you well?" "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I'm 7 weeks along, I've seen the doctor, everything is as it should be." He reached across the table and took both her hands in both of his, which was not his usual gesture, and held them carefully. "I'm glad," he said. "I'm very, very glad." "So am I," she said, and found that she entirely meant it, which was the resolution of something she had not known was unresolved until this moment. Some deep hesitation about the future that had lived quietly in her since Thomas's death, and that this particular gladness had finally, gently, unlocked. Their son was born in July of 1885, in the heat of a Kansas summer that pressed down on the plains like a warm hand. He came into the world at 3 in the morning with the assistance of the county's midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Aldrich, who had delivered approximately half the children in Sumner County over the last 15 years, and who managed the whole proceeding with a calm efficiency that Inez found deeply reassuring. Benjamin stayed in the house. He was not present in the room, which was not the custom and not the midwife's preference, but he was in the parlor the entire time, not sleeping, and when Mrs. Aldrich came to tell him it was over and mother and child were both well, Inez heard from the bedroom the long, slow exhale of a man releasing a breath he had been holding for hours. He came in, and she put the baby in his arms and watched him hold his son with the careful, wondering quality of a man, encountering something he had not quite believed was real until this moment. "He looks like you," she said, which was not entirely accurate because the baby looked mostly like babies look, red and cross and freshly arrived, but there was something around the eyes. "He has your ears," Benjamin said, which she was not sure was a compliment, but she received it as one. They named him William Thomas Hudson, William for Benjamin's father and Thomas for hers, which felt like the right acknowledgement of the people who had come before, and the land and struggle and love that had made this moment possible. Will, as he quickly became, was a large and vigorous baby who developed opinions early and expressed them loudly, which both his parents found delightful and exhausting in roughly equal measure, and which Clara Finch, who was effectively his honorary aunt from the first week, found entirely hilarious. The years that followed had the quality of a life that has found its shape, and is now filling that shape with the particular richness that comes from stability and love and work you believe in. The Lockhart land continued to operate under Inez's primary management, and she expanded the cattle operation to the point that by 1887 it was turning a genuine profit separate from the Hudson Range income, which gave her a satisfaction she could not entirely put into words because it was partly about money and partly about something older and more personal, the proof that she had been right to stand alone at that auction rather than accept defeat. That the land her father had built and that she had poured 6 years of her own effort into had been worth fighting for. Benjamin's operation grew too, steadily, responsibly, in the careful way of a man who knows that sustainable growth is worth more than spectacular expansion. By 1887, the Hudson Cattle Company ran close to 3,000 head and employed 7 full-time hands and was known throughout Sumner County as a model of how a cattle operation could be run with fairness to the land and honesty with its neighbors. Randolph Kane, it was reported in the Eagle, served 18 months in federal prison on the fraud convictions, after which he left Kansas entirely and was not heard from again in Sumner County, which was, as Art Finch observed, the best possible outcome for everyone concerned. In the spring of 1888, Inez told Benjamin she was expecting again. He took this news with the same quality of deep, warm gladness as the first time, and she laughed at him for it. "You were worried the first time," she said. "You sat down suddenly in the kitchen." "I wasn't worried," he said. "I was overwhelmed." "There's a difference." "There is. Worry is concerned with bad outcomes. What I felt was just the size of it, how large and important it was." She looked at him across the kitchen table with 3-year-old Will attempting to climb his father's chair in the background, and she felt the accumulated warmth of 5 years of mornings like this one, of the specific ordinariness of their life together, which was the most extraordinary thing she had ever built. And she thought about the woman who had stood alone in the Caldwell Square in October of 1882 with white-knuckled gloves and a fury and a secret hope, and she felt a love for that woman, for her own past self, that surprised her with its tenderness. That woman had been brave enough to write a letter. She had been brave enough to stand in public and refuse to disappear. And because of those 2 acts of stubbornness and faith, here was this kitchen and this man and this child in the chair and another one coming, and a land that was hers, fully and legally and permanently hers, and a life that had the solid, generous weight of something real. Their daughter was born in November of 1888, which made her a winter child, and she came into the world with a determined quality that expressed itself immediately in the loudness of her arrival. They named her Clara Margaret Hudson, Clara for Clara Finch, who sat in the parlor during the birth and cried with happiness afterward, and Margaret for Benjamin's mother, who had died the previous year in Missouri, but whose photograph sat on the mantelpiece beside the window where the morning light came in best. Clara Finch herself, when told of the name, said nothing for a full 10 seconds and then put her arms around Inez and held her in the particular tight, fierce way of a woman who has been given something she did not expect to receive and does not quite have words for, and Inez held her back with equal ferocity. The two children, Will and young Clara, grew up on the land between the Lockhart property and the Hudson Range, with the particular freedom of children raised in open country, which is a different kind of childhood from any other. They learned to ride before they were properly steady on their own legs, or so it seemed to anyone watching. They knew the names of every hand on both properties, and were known to those hands in return with the genuine affection that children earn from working people, when the children themselves have been raised with respect and directness rather than indulgence. Will had his father's patience and his mother's particular quality of watching things carefully before he spoke, which made him unusual among boys his age, and would serve him well as he grew. Young Clara had her mother's stubbornness and her father's warmth and a specific fearlessness about physical risk that gave both of her parents equal measures of pride and terror. In 1890, when Will was 5 and Clara was 2, Benjamin came to Inez with a proposition. He had been approached by the Sumner County Agricultural Society, a newly formed organization of landowners and farmers, to take a leadership role in an effort to negotiate collective water rights agreements with the railroad company, which was claiming certain water access rights along the southern boundary of the county in ways that would affect smaller operations significantly. He wanted her opinion on whether he should accept, not as a formality, but because he had come to trust her judgment on matters that combined the political and the practical in ways that her particular combination of experience and intellect navigated well. She thought about it for a full day and then gave him her answer over dinner, with the children occupied at the other end of the table with corn and general commentary on each other's eating habits. "Take it," she said, "but on specific terms. You will represent the whole county's interests, not just the larger operations. The small homesteaders need a voice in those negotiations as much as anyone." He looked at her with the quality of attention she had learned to recognize as him incorporating what she said and taking it seriously. "Yes," he said, "you're right." "I know," she said, which made Will look up from his corn with an expression of interested attention. The water rights negotiations took the better part of 1890 and involved 3 trips to Wichita and 1 to Topeka, and a great deal of correspondence, and more than one meeting that lasted past midnight in the Caldwell courthouse. Benjamin handled them with the same quality of calm, direct persistence that she had observed in him from the first day in the Caldwell Square, and the eventual agreement, which was reported on extensively in the Eagle, was considered a genuine success for the smaller landowners in particular. It was, Inez thought, not unlike what she had done at the auction, standing in the open and refusing to be moved. The methods were different, but the underlying quality was the same: the refusal to accept that power and money and the hidden machinery of those with more of both were simply the way things were and the way they would remain. That quality was why she had loved him from the beginning, she thought, or one of the reasons. The others were more personal and various, and had accumulated over the years into a body of knowing that was so integrated into how she experienced the world that she could not imagine now the texture of a day without him in it, without his voice in the morning and his steady presence in the evenings, and the particular way he looked at her sometimes across the table, or across a room that communicated, without any words needed, all of it. The love and the respect and the ongoing choice of her that he made every day and that she made back. On their 10th anniversary, in June of 1893, he found her in the garden in the early morning before the children were awake, pulling weeds from the beds she had replanted after the dry summer of the previous year had taken the first planting. He sat down on the low bench at the garden's edge, which was his particular habit during her gardening hours, and he said, 10 years. 10 years, she agreed, working the root of a stubborn weed free. Do you remember what you told me the night of our wedding, that you hadn't expected to be happy again in that particular way? She sat back on her heels and looked at him. The early morning light was gold and the garden smelled of earth and the new things growing in it. I remember. Are you, he asked, happy in that way? She looked at him for a moment. This man with gray eyes that had gone a little deeper over 10 years and the lines around them a little more definite. This man who had ridden into an auction to do a right thing and had somehow become everything to her, slowly and honestly, and without any drama beyond the drama of two people learning to trust each other completely. I am happy in ways I had not imagined existed, she said, which was true, and which she said directly and without qualification because that was how they had always spoken to each other and she intended for it to be how they always would. He smiled the real smile, the one she had first seen in November of 1882, and in it she could still see the man he had been then, the same honesty and the same warmth and the same quality of simply meaning what he felt. She stood up from the garden and walked over to him and sat beside him on the bench, and he put his arm around her with the easy certainty of 10 years' habit, and they sat in the morning garden with the day beginning around them, and the children asleep in the house, and the land spread out in every direction, her land, their land, the land that a fraud had tried to take, and that a man with gray eyes and a quiet voice had paid $5,000 to give back. And she thought that the story of how they came to be here was the strangest and most perfect story she knew. She had stood alone at that auction. She had written a desperate letter to a man she did not know. She had watched a stranger bid on her land, and walked toward her through the splitting crowd with the unhurried certainty of someone who knew what he was doing. And she had looked at him with a watchful fury and asked him what he expected in return for his $5,000. And he had said nothing that you're thinking, and it had been true. It had been completely and entirely true. And she had spent 10 years with the man who said it, and never found evidence that he had been wrong. He had given her back her land. And then, over time, in a way neither of them had planned for but both of them had chosen at every step, she had given him something too, or they had built it together from the materials of their separate hard lives and their compatible natures and their willingness to be honest with each other even when it was inconvenient, which was the only way she knew how to love anyone and the only way she wanted to be loved. The garden was warm and the morning was full of the sound of birds, and somewhere inside the house she could hear Will, who was now 8 and constitutionally incapable of sleeping past sunrise, beginning to move around with the energy that would shortly come bursting out the back door and into the yard with a velocity that always impressed her. And young Clara would follow with her determined quality at a slightly more dignified pace, because she had decided at age 3 that she had a dignity to maintain. Benjamin felt the beginning of all this through whatever calibration husbands develop for the sounds of their own households, and he kissed her temple with the ease of long habit and said, "Ready for the day." "Always," she said. The back door opened and Will came out into the morning at full speed, followed approximately 15 seconds later by Clara at a measured trot, and the garden was briefly full of children and noise, and the particular texture of a life that was, in all the ways that mattered, complete. She would add to it. Over the following years there would be more of this, more mornings and more arguments about politics, and more newspapers at the table, and more watching their children become themselves on the land that she had refused to let go of, more evenings with Clara and Art Finch across the dinner table, and Senora Vargas still in the kitchen at the Hudson Range making something wonderful. More of the accumulated particular ordinary extraordinary days that make up a life. But in the garden on this June morning, With 10 years behind them and all the rest ahead, Inez Lockhart Hudson allowed herself simply to be where she was, which was home, which was with him, which was exactly where she had arrived by way of the longest and most unexpected and most essential journey of her life. She had stood alone at an auction in Caldwell, Kansas, in October of 1882. She had not been alone since. She would not be alone again, and she was grateful for every improbable step of the road that had made it so. And she was grateful most of all for the man beside her, who had walked into the highest point of her crisis and made a quiet, generous choice, and in doing so had changed everything, not just the deed in her hand that day, but the entire direction of her life and the quality of everything that came after. This was the story she told their children when they were old enough to ask, and it was the story their children told in turn, and it was a story about the land and about justice and about courage, but mostly it was a story about two careful people who found each other in a difficult moment and had the wisdom to hold on,